Perfect, everyone. Welcome to our Geography Matters for June 2024, Girt by Sea. I'd like to welcome you all tonight as we'll be hearing from Adjunct Associate Professor Kevin Kane, who'll be discussing the challenges and opportunities for a modern port authority by examining the environmental and sustainability program of North Queensland Bulk Ports Corporation, who operate 3 priority ports in the Great Barrier Reef Marine World Heritage Area. Now, just before we get started, a little bit of housekeeping. As I've noted before, this is a recorded meeting. It will be available up on social media in the coming days. So please do make sure that your camera and microphone are off, unless, of course, you would like to be featured at some point throughout this evening's presentation. Likewise, if you do have any questions or any queries for our presenters this evening, please do throw those into the chat. As we'll be getting to those after the main presentation. Before we get rolling, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're all meeting this evening. For myself, that's the Yuggera and Turrbal peoples, and I would like to recognise their continuing connection to land, in particular for this evening, waters and culture. We pay our respect to all elders past, present and emerging, and those Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us this evening. Also, a quick highlight, as always, RGSQ has a vibrant and frequent program of events and activities. For those that have missed the email that came out a little bit earlier today, we do have plenty coming up over the next month, including at the end of this month, on the 25th of June, our Geography and Conversation panel series. We'll be talking about a plastic problem. We also have our treks and activities heading up to the Hidden Vale Wildlife Research Station and UQ Gatton campus on Tuesday, the 27th of June. We have our monthly lecture coming up on the 2nd of July, talking about turtles in trouble, impact of marine debris and recent flooding events on Southeast Queensland sea turtles. And this time next month, our next Geography Matters, where we'll be looking at the significance of Ediacaran fossil record on South Australia for understanding the unfolding of animal life on Earth. Plenty coming up. Please do check the website to register for those events. Places are running out, particularly for the treks that are coming up. With that, though, let's get into some bios and some background on our fantastic speakers and interviewer for this evening. We're really pleased to be joined by Kevin Kane, who is a respected leader in sustainability and environmental stewardship with extensive experience driving innovative solutions and fostering sustainable practices. As the Senior Manager of Sustainability and Environment at North Queensland Bulk Ports Corporation, Kevin has led programs to integrate environmental sustainability with industry operations, setting new standards for corporate responsibility. Kevin's global influence is highlighted by his co-chairing of an international working group that developed a best practice guideline on environmental risk management. Beyond North Queensland Bulk Ports, Kevin is a non-executive director of several natural resource management organisations and serves as an adjunct associate professor at James Cook University, bringing bridging research with practical applications. Known for his ability to engage diverse stakeholders, Kevin ensures environmental considerations are prioritised in decision-making processes. His commitment to sustainability is evident in both his professional achievements and personal passion for environmental protection and stewardship. Kevin will be in conversation this evening with Christopher Zinn, who has used a geographical perspective throughout his journalistic career in print, radio, and television. Graduated with a Geography MA from Oxford, and after training in newspapers, left the UK to report from Asia and the Pacific. For the ABC, he covered the Royal Geographical Society's expedition for the Kimberley Research Project in Western Australia in 1988, and he's reported for Channel 9, ABC Radio and TV, as well as various newspapers in Australia and overseas. He's recently moved to Brisbane and I'm told is loving the weather and is intent on exploring Queensland and its people with a geographer's eye. With that, I'll throw to Chris before we dive into the presentation.
Thank you very much, John. And of course, with some of the Society's field trips. Look, I'd all start, Seneca, a Roman statesman 2,000 years ago, said, if one does not know to which port one is sailing, no wind is favourable. And we're going to look at 4 ports today, so we know exactly where we're sailing, and we're in the very able hands of someone who in the next hour is going to tell you more about these 4 ports than 99.99% of Queenslanders know. So you're going to be in very select company. So I'd welcome Kevin, ask him to unmute, and I'll just sneak in a quick question before his presentation. What is the definition of a bulk port? How bulky do you have to be?
A bulk port, I suppose the definition is it's not containerized. At the end of the day, it's not in a container. So you'll notice when I talk through a lot of our export products like bauxite and coal are obviously loaded directly into the belly of the ship. A lot of our imports that come in through Mackay, like sugar, sugar is export, fuel and the like, they're not in a container. So I suppose that's the definition of bulk. Very different to a lot of your ports, in Sydney and Melbourne. That is a very large, I suppose, container aspect to their trade. We have a little bit, but not a lot.
Okay, well, please, Girt us by sea.
Thank you very much, Chris. And thank you all for having me along tonight. Girt by sea. So yeah, the fourth line, I believe, of our national anthem. And quite appropriate, I think. My focus, as John suggested, I'm the Senior Manager Sustainability and Environment for North Queensland Bulk Ports. I can certainly answer a question about our trade and some of the commercial aspects and operations of the port, but my focus will be on that word sustainability, what it means to the port industry, and what environmental stewardship, examples of environmental stewardship, that we demonstrate. So, no further ado, I'll continue to run along. And why did that not work? All right, use the mouse. There we go. I'll also acknowledge the traditional owners on the land at which we meet tonight. Their spiritual connection to land and sea is particularly important to us, because we do work on that complex interface of both the land and the sea. And sea country to a lot of the traditional owners at our ports is equally, if not more important, and quite important for us to understand, I suppose, as the majority landholder in many of the port areas. Who is North Queensland Bulk Ports? We're actually a government-owned organisation or corporation. So we're not a government entity as such, but our shareholding ministers are ministers from government. For us specifically, they're the ministers of transport and treasury in Queensland. So they're our shareholding ministers. We have a board of directors that governs and represents those ministers. And we look after the 4 trading ports of Weipa to the very north. You'll see in the map there, in the Gulf of Carpentaria, and 3 in the Great Barrier Reef World Heritage coastline. I don't particularly underestimate the natural capital value and the iconic nature of the Gulf of Carpentaria, equally to the Great Barrier Reef coastline. It's got a lot of very unique values that we certainly don't ignore. We have 120 employees thereabouts. That's up and down, 10-ish every now and then. About 1,000 people that call our ports their place of work, and about 28,000 jobs indirectly related to the ports, the 4 ports. And I suppose our import-export web extends to many parts of the world, as you can sort of see in that diagram. So we're really, for small, fairly regional areas of Queensland, we have quite a lot of our fingers reach out into quite a lot of supply chain. I'll just quickly run through each of the ports so you get a bit of an idea of each of them, starting from north to south, because that's how my mind works. The Port of Weipa, it's bauxite is the predominant trade out of Weipa. That gets mined in Weipa. Some of it goes overseas. A lot of it goes down the coast to Gladstone, where it's refined. Over the years, up to about almost 40 million tonnes at some point. That's really come back in the last year, 15 million tonnes. The mining leases in Weipa, where the township currently is, are coming to an end of life in the next decade or so, and new leases have been taking up further south. So we've got some in the next decade some decisions to make about what that future of that port looks like. But currently, still 271 ships a year in and out, and quite a significant part of Queensland's economy. The Port of Abbott Point is the first of our most northern of our Queensland ports. It's a particularly pretty port. It's a deep water port, so it's about 18 meters deep where you see those terrestrial, so it's a naturally deep port. which is fantastic when you're bringing ships in and out because it means less maintenance of those navigational areas. So in many of our ports, we undertake the likes of maintenance dredging to keep that infrastructure clean and safe and accessible. At Abbott Point, we very rarely have to do that because it's such a deep water port. You can see in the background quite an extensive area of wetland there in that. That's the Cayley Valley wetland. Again, it's an important wetland, and we're on a very, as I said, a very complex interface there between that marine environment where we've got turtle nesting, inshore coral reefs, seagrasses, a very significant wetland, some very, very high cultural values in the area. So quite a unique place in that it's about 35 kilometres to the closest town. So it's out of the road, and it's certainly not in any close proximity to to residents. So that urban encroachment is not a problem we have at Abbott Point. About 360 ships a year, and currently a sort of a what's that, a 40-60 split of energy coal as opposed to as opposed to metallurgical coal, which is made for steel. Excuse me. And excuse my croaky voice. My grandchildren are sharing their love and their germs this weekend. So the Port of Mackay. The Port of Mackay is the Quiet Achiever. That's where I currently am based and live. We have an office here in Mackay and a corporate office also in Brisbane. It's pretty standard, around that 200 ships a year, around the 3 to 3.5 million tons. But in comparison to 15 million tons of bauxite and 50 million tons of coal, and Hay Point, which I'll talk about shortly, was over 100 million tons. 3.5 million tons is a very small number, but it does account for a little over 40% of our revenue base. So it is by far the Quiet Achiever, in a very substantial port. It services the region. It services the Bowen Basin mining houses. Fuel imports is probably the biggest product coming in. Usually about 48% of our trade. Sugar going out is obviously another big part of the trade because we're a sugar city. And there are various imports around, break bulk cargoes to service the mining areas, magnetite, and believe it or not, export of grain has been going out of Mackay for many years, and it's quite a significant amount, around that sort of 0.3 to 0.4 million tons, and a bunch of other, I suppose, multi-cargo products. Scrap steel is an example. We have fertilizers and a few other things. So the scrap steel trade is quite significant, and actually surprisingly accounts for a lot of the steel that's produced, or recycled, if you like. And the Port of Hay Point, it's the biggest one as far as tonnage goes. It's 100% a coal export facility. I think it's the second largest in the world, Newcastle being the biggest, around that 100 million tons of volume per annum, with a little over 1,000 ships in and out every year. And I'll put that into context. It sounds like a massive number, but I'll put that in the context of some of our European counterparts shortly. So that's our port. They're all absolutely gorgeous coastal environments. They're beautiful places to visit and to work. And I think we, as an organisation, take that as a privilege, not as a burden. And that's a key. I think that's a key factor for why we've been fairly successful in leading sustainability and stewardship in this part of the world. This is a fantastic quote that I love from a few years ago, and it comes back to what Chris said earlier, that basically just about the most important economic driver for any country is the fact that they're all developed around a port. So there's very few countries in the world that haven't started and been developed around a commercial port. Ever since man, there's records of the Vikings and the like, and that's really important, and that actually dictates some of the pressures that we deal with day in, day out, that I'll talk about more as we go along tonight. The thing for Australia is we are very truly an island nation, and surprisingly to a lot of people, that over 99% of the trade in and out of Australia is by ship. Which is a massive number. It's very rarely below 99%. I've seen it as high in the ABS stats as 99.7%. So that's, there's not very much comes by plane. And at the end of the day, planes are never going to have the capability of a ship. Technology might be good, but it's not going to be that good. Ships will get faster, they will get bigger, and they will get more capable and more efficient. But I don't see that they'll ever get up and fly. So, the take-home message for myself, my team, and I suppose our ethos into how we operate our business is it's an intergenerational viewpoint we've got to take. Ports have been around for generations, and they must be around for generations to come. And that really does drive our sustainability portfolio, and certainly my team. Why those credentials? Why is demonstrating your ESG impact, I suppose, is some of the modern term of the sustainability. Why is that important? It is. I did suggest it is that very complex interface between the marine and terrestrial ecosystems, and we've got to be respectable for that. We've got to know our backyard. So a lot of what we do as far as our environmental programs is understanding what happens in our backyard, so that we can manage our operations effectively. There's no denying, and everyone is very aware, that the world's populations will continue to grow, and the reliance on ports around the world, and in Australia particularly, means that we've got to be able to grow with that population. We've got to be able to maintain, develop, and modernise and meet societal demands. And as I suggested before, we're intergenerational asset. We've been around for generations, and we've got to be around for generations to come. One of my very first CEOs in this industry he phrased it very simply and very Australian, was we've got to pass the silly bugger test in 50 years time. So which resonates. Just a very short perspective of what else goes in the world. I was lucky enough some years ago to visit a lot of the key ports in various areas of the world, particularly in Europe. So the big ones in Europe being Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and Antwerp. Just for context, the population sizes of those cities: Amsterdam 800,000, Rotterdam 610,000, Antwerp 400. Europe 752 people, and Europe's pretty small, and they have this what they call the banana economy. So those three ports, if you have a really good imagination, they may form a banana shape, but they service more than half of the European population from those three ports. So 350 million people get service from those three port areas. Population density wise, we're talking 2.5 to 4,500 people per square kilometre in the immediate vicinity of the port. So some of the pressures they face are quite real, and they've been around since the 16th century. So there's some legacy things there that they're certainly dealing with, because ports around the world have had they've not really been environmentally aware until this century, and there are some legacy issues to deal with. Excuse me. So some of if you put a lens on sustainability for those ports, what drives that? If you really focus on what drives what they do on a day-to-day basis as far as their ESG impact and performance, emissions is massive. You're thinking you've got 4,500 people living in your back pocket. Emission reduction, so that you're reducing your emission loads in the atmosphere. Energy consumption, everyone's competing for energy and cheap energy. Waste management is a huge aspect of the management of society and in all of those port areas, because they produce vast volumes of waste. Freight efficiency, why that's important is to put it in perspective. So we have about 1,000 ships a year at Hay Point. Port of Rotterdam, when I was over there some years ago, had 36,000 vessels for the year. So work that into number of movements per day, it's a very big number. And then once those seagoing vessels, so 36,000 seagoing vessels visited the port in a year. And that's the Port of Rotterdam that I've got in the picture there. And then thereafter, there was 110,000 inland barge movements, vessels in that same year. So collectively about 150,000 vessels buzzing around that part of Europe in a year. And we've got a second largest coal port in the world with 1,000 vessels. So it sort of puts it in perspective. But it asks the question about, okay, well, what does our sustainability lens look like, and what drives it? So you can sort of see why the Europeans, why they have legislation around air emissions, and quite strong legislation around energy consumption and waste management, and the like. And these numbers are probably a couple of years old now, but it's the scale of difference. Our capital cities are around the 400 people per square kilometre. Where I live in Mackay, it's down about 16 people per square kilometre. So those things that are driving the sustainability portfolios of Ports over there are different here. So we don't have that same degree of urban encroachment. We don't have, all those things. Emissions are important, waste management is important, but they're not the focus of what we do. So it obviously begs the question to, what our focus is, and what is driving that focus. And a big part of it is in Australia, and I suppose all over the world, there is this increasing expectation that industry more broadly is leads, I suppose, in striving for better outcomes. So good environmental outcomes, truly demonstrating sustainability, and to know how to do that, we sort of need to understand what does our sustainability lens look like. And in this part of the world, where we are, urban encroachment's not an issue as far as the volume of people, but everyone lives on the coast in Australia, so it is an issue that we have to deal with, and we deal with that through land use planning. So basically, we are like the council on port lands. We're quite large landholders. Our ports operate a landlord model, so we have tenants that basically rent the land on us for their operations, and we facilitate trade as such. But we do look at protecting and making sure there's adequate barriers between us and residents. They don't need to be hearing noise from a ship at night time. We do have a lot of controls as far as emissions and those sort of things. But the really big one for us is that natural and iconic environments that we live in. We can see our environment from space. The World Heritage Area is a real thing that we've got to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. And we've demonstrated that. We certainly have a table of those leading conversations around the part we play in what's going on with the Great Barrier Reef, and the coastline more generally. So there's obviously a lot of recreational use of our coastlines. That aerial shot is a land holding that we've got. It's called Dudgeon Point. To the north of that, you can actually see the trestles from Hay Point Terminal sticking out. That's a land holding for future port activity. So quite a large land holding, and a really good example of how we're planning for the future, and being able to grow and modernise, and not having houses built in our back pocket. So social value is really strongly tied to those landscapes, and pests and diseases. That's a really important one for Australia. It sort of goes under the radar occasionally, but we do a lot of work as an industry, and certainly as a state and as a country, around our biosecurity. We have some of the best biosecurity measures in the world, and we take that very seriously, because we obviously have international trade in and out of our ports, and invasive marine species are a real concern. But we continue to lead, I suppose, in the development of new technologies and new ways to detect and manage invasive species. So, and it is really an important thing. And I won't go into it. One of my team is probably a leading expert in the world around invasive marine species. And Nikki will talk for hours about it, about how the destructive nature of them. So there's a future one, future presentation, if anyone's interested. So some of the challenges we face, and I'll step up the pace here and get through it a bit quicker for you, but obviously growing populations. There's by 2036, trade well and truly more than doubled where it is today. And we've obviously got to keep that in mind with our ports. Regulatory change, recognition of change and impacts. So, obviously climate change, overfishing, crown of thorns starfish, urban development, water quality, all those things on the reef, very important issues, and consequently have resulted in significant change in policy direction and legislation. An example of that is back in 2015. There was quite a bit of development planned for the Queensland coast, and as a consequence, there was quite a lot of, I suppose, planned, well, on paper planned or proposed new navigational requirements. So new channels, new berth pockets, new dredging, capital dredging. And the government at the time decided, and a lot of uncertainty with what was going on with the Great Barrier Reef. There was demonstrated declines, and not a lot of science to support why those declines were being seen. And one of the proactive measures was to ensure that there was any of that capital dredging that had to occur at priority ports. So in Queensland, we now have 5 priority ports, and they're the ones where we will focus our expansion and intention on growth. The others we won't. I think there's about 15. I can't remember exactly, but it's around the 15 mark ports, including regional ports in Queensland. And consequently, they only occur at priority ports, and that material that we take off the seafloor is to be managed on land. So it's not to be put back in the marine environment. Whereas our maintenance of that infrastructure does go back in the marine environment because it's back into the natural terrain. So our deeper, less energetic berth pockets and navigational channels just act like silt traps as natural processes go up the coast, which is south to north in our part of the world. They tend to trap the finer material, and fairly regularly we pick that up and relocate that fairly close by normally, but we put that on approved areas back into the sediment train. Highly managed, highly regulated activity, but for the capital or new development works, it's a different story. Social media certainly changed our world over the last few years. Information is so quickly available, whether it's true or not. And back in that sort of 2013 to 15 era, we had some UNESCO reactive monitoring missions to the Great Barrier Reef, some of that legislative change, and a bit of misinformation about, and there was even pictures of some of our visited reefs that were supposedly being dredged. It was far from the truth. We obviously go nowhere near the reef, but that's not what the message was overseas. And Ben and Jerry got involved, and Leonardo DiCaprio had his say. And but that does, it's something that there was a new world. That information was available immediately, and gone in the headline papers of the newspapers. They were on social media very quickly. So we've had to really build. We had to change our concentration on the importance of stakeholder engagement, trusted, robust information, third party peer review of that information and the like. So really 2013, 14, 15, was a pivotal moment for ports more generally in the world, and particularly in Australia, that we really had to step up our game as far as we were doing great things, but we certainly weren't advertising them particularly well. We weren't backing them with really good, sound, robust science, and that's something we do particularly well nowadays. This is a really important one. The picture on the left is what the 1970s used to look like at the port. And you used to be able to take the kids down and the family down and have fish and chips and watch the ships come in, and literally play right next to the ships. And then post 9/11 and new security legislation, the picture on the right is what modern day ports are like now. You can't get in without maritime security cards. You can't get in with a whole bunch of clearances. So we've really excluded our communities from the port areas. And that's something we've had to deal with. It's okay. Well, there used to be a bit of ownership. People used to felt that they owned their regional port. Now they're outside the gates, not being let in, and that does that can result in some mistrust. So you've really got to focus on building that trust and through a whole bunch of variety of mechanisms. So it does lead to opportunities.
Kevin, I know that there's quite a few opportunities on these slides, but the opportunity cost is we'll run out of time for questions. So if you could
speed it up, definitely.
A bit of turbocharge on the opportunities so we can get to it in time.
So I suppose my team particularly spend a lot of time in leading the science, the publications, informing the regulation And there's many examples of that. We actively partner with the right people, the right scientists, the right community groups, and you know, that instills trust. And we certainly do a lot of community programs. So even though we probably can't get inside the port boundaries, I suppose we spend a lot of time, you know, sponsoring fun runs and school programs and STEM programs, and we have about $200,000 in sponsorship available each year. We have an Eco Ports program for schools. We lead a lot of international guidelines in that sustainability and environment space. This is one that I helped co-author, and it's around, and the rest of the world is starting to wake up that if Australia actually lead the way in a lot of this stakeholder engagement. And what you'll see at the center of this is this early and ongoing stakeholder engagement now being the core to environmental management. So it's no longer, here's one we prepared earlier, and in consulting and in that aspect, it's actually getting stakeholders in on the ground and being transparent in your decision making. So we use a lot of decision making tools, structured decision making, where we actually understand what's important to a range of stakeholders and how that our decisions impact that. Environmental programs, we do lots in the marine space, in the air, in the land, and cultural values, waste. Our marine portfolio is probably one of the biggest in the world. We've had seagrass monitoring in place for 20 years. You know, it's 30,000 hectares of seafloor, 300 kilometres of coastline that we cover with our water quality loggers, 6 islands, 6 kilometres of transects. So there's a lot of work goes on continuously, and they're not one-off. Those loggers are in there continuously, day in, day out. It's 1 million data points a year. So we're contributing to the science and providing that information to the likes of Reef report cards and the like. Using data properly. This is Nikki and her marine biosecurity programs. Again, we're working with other ports. We're working with Biosecurity Queensland. eDNA is our latest trick up our sleeve. So we're actually establishing an EDA library so that we don't have to rely on pest plates, which they've got out there at the moment for settlement and invasive species or other species. We're actually now being able to do plankton toes and identify invasive species through their DNA. A lot of really good science and research going into that. Traditional owners, I said, very important part of our landscape. We have a reconciliation action plan, our second one now. We've got some award-winning programs with our traditional owners at our ports, and that continues to be a big focus. And we do a lot of sharing of our learnings. So we actually publish a lot, which is quite unusual for an industry group. We publish in the scientific literature. We publish in magazines and strategy guidelines all over the world. So and I suppose one of our biggest achievements was a program we started with James Cook University in 2017, and that's been $1 million a year. It's into research and monitoring, so they do all of our marine monitoring. They'll do a lot of research. We now have undergraduate and postgraduate scholarships. We have internship programs. We do guest lectures, and in the last 2 years, we've actually developed a master's course based on coastal management for ports, which is very successful. And the future, we're citizen science. We're working with a whole bunch of tourism operators in the Whitsundays. Beautiful part of the world, but it's between all our reefs. We're tagging manta rays for the first time, tracking them up and down the coast. We've actually got one of the first recorded cleaning stations off one of our ports. We're looking at biodiversity around port infrastructure, really important if you're talking about a future of working with nature and how do you, this whole concept of blue-green infrastructure. We're doing some work on reef modules and the like. We are refreshing our sustainability program at the moment. So we were one of the first port authorities to have a external facing sustainability program. And we're actually going through a refresh because that was 2015 when we went public. And there you go, Chris. Hopefully that was quick enough.
That was great. No, that was great. And we've heard that the ships are going to get faster in the future. You got very fast on that. And look, there's been some great questions sent in. I'm going to speak to you for a few minutes and then we'll get through all the questions. And I would encourage people to send in some questions. And also Kevin can have a look at the ones in chat so he can be prepared because some of them are pretty detailed. Yep. I suppose my first question would be, I used to thought that ports were just sort of cranes and piers and whatever, but there's a land side, there's a water side. You have responsibility for ships that go out to sea and the seabed. You probably have responsibilities on the land. I mean, how far do your responsibilities stretch beyond the actual port itself?
Yep. So our land holding is obviously different at each port. Mackay, which is the littlest footprint, it's about that 900 hectares. So it's not overly small. And on that 900 hectares, we basically become the council for that area. So any development on there, we're the assessment manager for development. So we have certainly a DA role, if you like. We provide all the services as far as roads, power, water, there's trade waste facilities, that sort of stuff. So we obviously do that in a lot of consultation with our regional councils, because ultimately they own the sewage treatment plants and the like. So and they're all defined. So it's all defined as strategic port land. And so it's very clearly defined.
I suppose what I also meant was, though, that, ships have spills, ships run, lose power and hit objects. There's a lot of things that could wake you up at night and give you a big headache.
They do, yes. It's a little bit of cross-jurisdictional responsibility, if you like. So Maritime Safety Queensland, for instance, is responsible for maritime safety. It's also responsible for marine pollution. So if there's a spill, they ultimately are the regulatory authority. We offer a first strike response service in that respect. So we have all of the oil spill booms and all of the train staff and etc. at the port, and we run exercises multiple times a year to make sure we're very, very well versed in that. And so we will offer that first strike response service until they come in as the national, I suppose, the Queensland based in this instance, authority and take over the incident as such. If that answers your question.
Okay. In terms of today's budget, how much did your ports actually help finance the giveaway?
Oh, I don't know the number, but it's got to be a good number. I think there's a recognition that it's the ports and it's the customer base of the ports. So we've got obviously the mining houses, some of the fuel majors, farming. There's quite a diverse product, but it really is. It's the backbone of the Queensland economy. And it's quite significant. So, and when we talk in sustainability space about a transition, to a new renewable economy, then it's the current customer base of the port that really is going to be the ones that will finance that. So I can't see a transition happening in the absence of that. I suppose the royalty that the state gets from the port.
Well, Adani signed a 99-year lease recently at Abbott Point, I believe, for something, $1 billion and something. So there's obviously going to be 99 years of coal going out of there.
Yeah, that's right. And I suppose Hay Point was the same some years ago. So when that was leased, the port of Hay Point, it was also a 99-year lease, which I believe is a 50-50 plus 50 option. So it's not a full 99, but yeah, there's the projections really are that, particularly in the steel making. So there's there really is very limited opportunity to get good quality, cheap steel without using high quality coal and metallurgical coal. There certainly are trial basis of not using coal in that at the moment, and that certainly will improve. But in the in the next 20, 30 years, it's really, there's still going to be a reliance. And no one's denying the renewable space is where we all need to be, but it's really, it can't happen overnight. It will happen, but Rotterdam's a good example. When I was over there some years ago, they have a massive amount of alternate renewable, not sun obviously, but wind turbines and the like. But they still relied on, I think it was 2 or 4 coal-powered coal-fired stations within the port area to provide power. So will transition. That's why I suppose it's called a transition. But it's certainly in my lifetime. We've got a plan that's still going to be there, and we still need to manage accordingly.
And I came across something called green methanol bunkering. Yep. In development at the Port of Melbourne, which replaces that filthy old oil which ships have been using for generations. I mean, is that something that's feasible on the horizon, do you think? Because I mean, the ships
so many options, so low sulfur fuels have been a thing for quite some time. And, there's some incentives for shipping companies to go to low sulfur fuels. The hydrogen discussions, one that's very active at the moment. LNG was active a few years ago, but green methanol really does fascinate me. I don't, I'm not a chemist by any chance, but it really does fascinate me in that, it's a product that can be made from from waste organic material or farmed organic material, sustainable farming of forestries to actually service that is an incredible idea. But the thing I love that makes sense to me is it's drop-in ready to a diesel engine as such. So it's very little change in the mechanical side of what we already have technology-wise. But we get a very low emission, almost zero emission product at the end. So yeah, certainly a lot happening in that space, and a lot of interest. And I think Tasmania also have just signed off on a trial basis for green methanol as well. So,
okay, one more question for me, and then we'll go to the questions. And I would encourage the audience to send in some more. Ports are run by the states, and some of those states have sold off some of those ports. Yet ports like yours service a global demand and supply. So how can, when they're run by the states, how do we get a proper global perspective on something to enrich the whole country, as opposed to having states competing with each other or duplicating facilities or whatever?
It's a really good question. And it's one of those questions that pops up. Certainly I've been here for nearly 15 years and it's popped up 3 times as a serious question. And it's those national plans and those international plans, and I think they make a lot of sense. It's surprising, particularly in Queensland, we tend to have a really good model where, we are separate port entities. 4 out of the 5 are government-owned corporations. Port of Brisbane's private. But we tend to work in this space particularly really effectively together and collectively. So we don't tend to do things just on our own. So in Queensland, we have a Queensland Ports Association, and it tends to drive that collaborative approach in the ignorance of that competitiveness, if you like. So we're doing a lot of alignment in those bigger things. The invasive marine species is a good example. All the ports in Queensland are funding that because it's that important to our industry in the future. But when it gets to trade coming out of individual ports, at the moment, it really is reliance on those people that are going to be bringing that trade. So if it's new hydrogen or new green methanol, or whatever, we're really at this stage, there's a bit of direction. Like, for instance, Abbott Point makes perfect sense for a lot of that greenfield development because we've got so much space and there's 35 kilometres. But it might not have some of the other capabilities the other ports have, access to transmission lines and service and roads and so forth. So there's a bit of weighing up, and really that comes back to in this stage, it's really the proponent, if you like, finding what the best fit is for them.
Okay, well, Ralph asks, how do the bulk ports work with other ports in the state, such as Gladstone, etc.? And you spoke about there being a cooperation.
Exactly in that sense. I suppose we've at least for the last decades, I suppose there are very few secrets as far as our management practices, overcoming some of those challenges together. Certainly there'll be secrets around, internal pricing policies and those sort of things. That's a very commercial nature, but we do operate very effectively for the greater good. I think Gladstone, another good example, it's sitting on the doorstep of a World Heritage coastline. So and Port of Cairns and Port of Townsville and the like. So we do a lot of that, particularly that sustainability work. We do a lot of that together.
Okay, now you did allude to this, and this is a question from Gustavo Martinez. With the trade volumes and type of commodities decreasing, such as bauxite and coal with net zero commitments, what's the future look like for Hay Point, Weipa and Abbott Point ports? Do you have plans to handle other types of cargo?
There's actually it's certainly no secret, it's in public. So even back as far as probably 5 years ago, maybe, we have a memorandum of understanding in place with Dalrymple Bay Coal Terminal or Dalrymple Bay Terminal in exploring hydrogen options for the port area. So, there's so things like hydrogen, things like green ammonia, they're all currently actively being explored as alternative trades, even by some of the mining companies and certainly a lot of the energy companies and the like. And our port development plan, so we have a 30-year master plan for each of the ports, each of the priority ports, and that sort of spells out what we expect the port to look like in the next 30 years. So as far as trade, as far as growth, as far as some of those constraints, as far as what we will put in place, as far as environmental management and the like. We also have development plans that are a live document within the organisation. So we do a lot in the way of trade analysis and understanding how things are being impacted in the world. Some of the changes in, I suppose, shipping routes, for instance, from the war in the Ukraine and the like. We've really had to understand what they mean for not just the short-term future of the port, for the longer term.
So, I mean, that trouble in South China would leave us all, South China Sea would leave us all in strife, but particularly yourselves.
That's right, yeah. And we've certainly got, Port of Weipa is very close to that, everything that goes on around the equator in the Northern Hemisphere there.
Okay, here's one from Mujahid Chowdhury, and I'll paraphrase and you'll find it. But he's wondering about the sustainable practices like energy management, waste treatment practices, etc., carbon emission management practices. Can you kind of summarize those things that you're responsible for?
Yep. So I suppose we're a government-owned corporation, so the government's emission targets are our emission targets. So that's sort of pretty simple. As I said, we're refreshing our sustainability policy, our program, which also includes our climate roadmap. And so, all of that low-hanging fruit that's available as far as, providing renewable energy to all our office spaces and workshops and all, that's all happening and happened. We're just starting to transition our fleets over. So we're not putting all our eggs in one basket and going fully electric. We've obviously, there's hydrogen cells and, ammonia and so forth and to consider. So we're developing a plan that really, how will we phase the transition over the next 3 to 5 years? But we've already started that, we've got a fleet of electric cars and hybrids and the like. Ship-to-shore power is a really interesting one in Australia. So it's a little bit of what they call cold ironing. It's like powering a small city for a night and then turning it off again. That conversation certainly comes up with cruise ships, in that's what you're going to do. You're basically going to provide the infrastructure to power a small city for a night and then turn it off and then do it again. So it's a massive infrastructure requirement. But it certainly is something that we as an industry are certainly looking at all the time. The likes of Rotterdam's a good example. I was over there probably 4 years ago. They've spent a lot of money. They're cold ironing all of their internal fleet, if you like. So their river barges and so forth. It's quite easy because they park up every night next to a dock and plug the power in. But their seagoing vessels, at that time, they only had one that they were actually providing ship-to-shore power for. Some of the constraints are that every ship's got a different power system. From where it comes from the world, it's a different plug, it's a different load requirement, it's different everything. So we've actually got in that conversation about ship-to-shore power, you've actually got to cater not only for those massive loads, pulse loads, but also the nuances of every ship being slightly different. So it's certainly something we spend a fair bit of time looking at, but there's not been a feasible solution at this point. If that's waste management, dredge material is a good one. So the dredge material, there's a thing called the London Protocol, which we're a signatory to. Australia is a signatory to, and dredge material gets captured as a waste at sea in that respect. So that's why it's so heavily regulated. And we do have to. The backbone for the London Protocol is this thing called the waste hierarchy. So it's this avoid, reduce, reuse, recycle. And we certainly do have a lot of opportunity to recycle things like good quality sand. Brisbane, Moreton Bay is a very good example. It's fantastic sand. It's great for construction. When you get a bit further north up here, we're predominantly fine silts and clays that we trap in our infrastructure, and it's not good for anything. No one wants to put it on the beach. It's certainly not a beach nourishment option. And places like the Netherlands quite effectively are using that material to combat climate change and sea rise. It's a different story for us. Putting marine fine silts and clay on shore is just a really poor environmental outcome. So putting it back into the natural sediment train makes by far the best sense. So it's actually, the focus is on managing that effectively.
Great. Geographers love to hear about sands and silts, or at least some of them. Ralph's asked about sea level rise and how will that affect port operations and how can you prepare for that?
Yeah, we've done some pretty extensive studies on sea level rise. We've used all the scenarios from the IPCC as far as what do we model. As far as sea level rise, we're pretty good. Most of our infrastructure's already catered for that, and even some of our port tenants. So the Port of Hay Point last year, they replaced a berth specifically for those reasons. It was a 40-year-old berth, but they replaced it and raised the level of it, to cater for potential sea level rise. We've done a lot of upgrades of things like breakwater structures and the like for more intense type cyclonic activity. The main areas where we'll be impacted is around access to the port. So sometimes, quite often, it's not even on our land. It's the road flooding in the region. That's the particular concern. So we obviously start to do a lot of work with our local councils and partner main roads and that sort of stuff. So we're reasonably, for our ports, we're actually pretty well off. All the projections are sort of saying there's going to be some minor stormwater upgrades and that sort of thing, but generally our infrastructure shouldn't be impacted. Everything's high enough. Our building codes that are currently in our development guidelines certainly cater for storm surge and climate change and sea level rise and increased intensities and all that sort of stuff. So we're in a pretty good position.
Coming to the last 5 minutes or so, Kevin, I mean, you've spoken a lot about the environmental credentials. Some people are going to be hard to convince. You've had demonstrators, I believe, at Abbott Point in the past who don't see thermal coal as particularly climate friendly. Obviously, that issue of damage to the sea floor and dredging and the barrier reef is a sensitive spot too. Are you just resigned to not being able to keep everyone happy, or do you keep trying?
Keep trying. So we transparency is probably a big part of that. Keep trying. It's not just keep trying and bashing your head against the wall. So I'll give the dredging activities a good example. So and you might see that later this year in about August at Hay Point. We now have we have real-time logging and monitoring going on out there. So real time, we cast that in real time to our website, to a dashboard on our website. It will give real-time water quality data, and it will give it in real time of where our management thresholds are. So at what point do we pull up, investigate what's going on, whether it's a weather event or something else. We're very clear on what our hold points are. Where do we pull up and stop doing what we're doing? We manage to a natural environment condition. So our trigger points are actually based on, a decade of full-time continuous logging data that allows us to know what goes on in our backyard, and we manage to natural conditions. So if we're starting to actually impact through activities beyond natural conditions, we pull up, we investigate, we look at options. So we put that live on our website, and we even now have a transponder on the dredge so that there's absolutely no secrets of where that dredge is operating at any time of the day or night in respect to what's going on with water quality. That's actually, that approach has instilled a fair bit of trust in that it's accessible to everyone. So there's no arguments. There it is. Obviously, our regulators love it because it's open, it's transparent, it's honest, and it's examined at the end of the day by credentialed scientists and peer reviewed. So that's how we deal with it. I suppose it's not going to go away, but it's. I think we've recognised quite some years ago that robust, honest, transparent is the way.
Right, and I'll just wrap up with a couple of questions, quite technical ones. If you could give quick answers. How do you measure your environmental, social, and economic return on practicing sustainability?
ESG impact. Yes, we actually have. So we have stakeholder survey is one of the key things. It's actually just come back this year. We do that year on year, and that's with our customer base. It's with our community members. It's with government. It's with a whole bunch of tier 1 and tier 2 stakeholders. That's a really good place for us to gauge our impact more broadly with society, with our economics, what people know about the port. Do they trust our environment programs? Some very core questions. Very useful tool.